Karine, and if you want to go on ahead and upload your PowerPoint, you should be able to because you are the co-host.
Is everybody seeing this? Okay. Okay, so let me begin by thanking Lale for inviting me to present on my work. I'm really honored to speak to all of you this evening. So I was asked to begin, as Lale said, to discuss how I came to this topic and how I situate my current work. And my field, which is the history of the United States and the world. And I have to admit, when I was asked to include this as part of my presentation, I hesitated about whether or not I should go back to the actual explanation of how and why I study what I study. In many ways, because it's very deeply personal. I'm going to go ahead and do this, and I hope you'll bear with me, because I think that the story is actually more intellectually honest. And I also think it addresses my own positionality as a scholar, which is particularly important for Americans who study U.S. foreign relations more generally, but also scholars who write about America's relationship with the Middle East more specifically, given its long and fraught history. So let me begin. So I was born in small town Iowa in 1973 to immigrant parents from France who raised me as an atheist. My father, who was born in 1924, had come to the United States in large part, I think, as an escape from the humiliation he had suffered as a child of color, born out of wedlock in a family of devout Catholics. And until her dying day, my grandmother always refused to tell my father who his father was. I learned how to speak English in preschool and proceeded to learn a great deal about American culture in elementary school. When I was in kindergarten, I came home from school one day and asked my mother who Jesus was, because my teacher had brought this up in class. And she proceeded to call the school and remind them, with her deep French accent, about the fact that this was a public school and the teacher was not respecting the separation of church and state. So despite this, I clearly remember in subsequent years, Jesus being mentioned by my peers and my teachers quite a bit in school, something I hid from my mother to avoid the embarrassment of future calls. So I wasn't able to find a statistic for 1973 when I was born, but according to a 2008 Pew survey, 88% of people in Iowa at that in 2008, were absolutely or fairly certain that God exists, which seems to correlate with my own childhood experience. So besides frequent reminders by my classmates about the consequences of not believing in Jesus, what I remember most vividly from my childhood were also the constant questions about my racial background. And I don't have the statistics for how white my town was when I was a child, but I will say that besides the one Black child who was bused into my elementary school from a neighboring town, everyone else in my elementary school class was white, and not just white, often naturally blonde white, like my brother, who had the genetic traits that allowed him to escape these questions. So by a young age, I had fully integrated that being associated with people of color was a bad thing, so I used to lie and say I was part Italian. So these experiences were formative for me, and they are the reason I was drawn to studying the relationship between religion, race, and American citizenship. Before pursuing my PhD in history at Columbia, however, after my undergraduate years, I moved to France in 1996 and later spent 2 years studying sociology at the University of Paris 8, which is one of the universities that was created from the 1968 global movement. My MA thesis focused on French Muslim women of North African origin and their decision to wear the veil. And based on my interviews with about 24 women, I argued in my thesis that veiling for them could be understood as a form of feminist activism. For those of you who know France and its relationship to Muslim citizens, you can probably imagine how that went over. 2 professors refused to participate in my thesis defense, and my MA was given a 10 out of 20, which is the minimum score to pass. So from there, I moved to New York City in the fall of 2000, where I began my PhD program. And my proposed dissertation topic at that time was to pursue a comparative study of the history of Arab Muslim migration to France, the United States, and Canada. Soon after I arrived, I was told by one professor that I should change topics because nobody cared about Muslims in the United States. And later I did give up on this topic, not because of this professor, but because, of course, of 9/11 and the US government's subsequent treatment of Arab and Muslim immigrants and citizens in the United States. Some of you will remember that during this time in academia and in media as well, Samuel Huntington's clash of civilization theory also came back to the fore. So American media was also regurgitating some of the same tropes about Islam and Muslims that I had seen back in France during this time. American empire in the Middle East, expressed through rhetoric defending the global war on terror, was now being introduced once again as a benevolent force for advancement. And again, this language was very reminiscent of previous discourse defending both European and American imperial expansion. Depictions of Islam and Muslims during this time in many ways mirrored 19th century French Orientalist views of the Middle East and North Africa. And in many ways, it was this realization that led me to work on my dissertation project, which examined how ideas about Islam shaped American foreign relations in the long 19th century. And this is the dissertation that later became my first book. So my current project, which I'll speak about this evening, emerged from the research that I conducted for my first book, which in large part focused on how American missionaries shaped American foreign relations. The missionary group that I study in this new book had barely received any scholarly coverage, despite the fact that they played this really important role in Ibn Saud's decision to grant an oil concession to the United States. So this book was also shaped by the experience of living and teaching in Qatar, where energy, labor, and Islam occupy a central role in global discourse about this country. As many of you know, Qatar also hosts the largest American military base in the Middle East. So stepping back beyond these personal experiences, clearly, my current work also builds on the scholarship of several scholarly fields, including the work by Robert Vitalis, Toby Jones on Aramco, as well as scholars who focus on the history of American missionaries, and also American intellectual historians who in the last few years have worked on the history of development and modernization theory. My work is trying to address and bridge these fields, which have often remained in intellectual silos. And I should also say that this book is approaching the copy editing stage. So if any of you think that my ideas are completely off, maybe try to be more gentle. So that said, let me now turn to my paper for this evening, which focuses on the 3 groups of American actors: Protestant missionaries, oil executives, and the US government, and how they shaped Americans' relationship with Saudi Arabia and the broader Arabian Gulf in the period between 1889 and the 1950s. So in 1955, the Arabian American Oil Company, better known as Aramco, reached out to the award-winning author William Stegner to write a history of the company's establishment in Saudi Arabia. Stegner's book was meant to serve as a public relations piece at a time when Aramco was facing accusations of economic imperialism in Saudi Arabia. Political developments in the Middle East, including Iran's nationalization of their oil company in 1951, also pushed Aramco to emphasize its benevolent presence in Saudi Arabia and the ways in which the oil company was bringing technological development to the country. As scholars have already demonstrated, Stegner's celebration of the company's work ignored the realities of Aramco's exploitative and racialized labor practices, and instead lauded the progress, development, and modernity Americans were allegedly bringing to Saudi Arabia. So what many scholars have ignored, however, is another important flaw in the book. Stegner maintained that, quote, according to a traditional formula, the flag followed the missionaries and trade followed the flags. Here, trade came first and came alone, end quote. However, as in other areas of the Middle East, trade had in fact followed American Protestant missionaries to Saudi Arabia. American missionaries had been in the Arabian Gulf since 1889, and by the time American oil executives arrived, seeking to sign new oil concessions, missionaries had forged close relationships with Gulf rulers, including the future founder of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud. American oil developers benefited directly from the missionaries' network of contacts and later relied on their cooperation in advancing their interests in the area. So although Stegner omitted this story from his book, he nonetheless explicitly compared American oil developers to missionaries. In his words, these men were, quote, missionaries of the American way of life. Such comparisons appeared over and over again in his book, and his words here are worth quoting at length. Yet no one hesitated. This was part of their missionary effort. Here he's talking about American oil executives. Part of the contribution Americans tended to make wherever they went, whatever the implications. They would have said that they were building something new in the history of the world, not an empire made for plundering by an intruding power, but a modern nation in which American and Arab could work out fair contracts, produce in partnership, and profit mutually by their association. Gradually, Aramco was teaching some of the functions of modern man. In theory, it would sometimes get repaid for its teaching, but if it did not, the field at least would not complain. It could look at the wells and the reclamation projects, the roads, the schools, the improvement in public health, and feel good enough simply to have had a hand in it. Stegner also maintained that Aramco's development work in Saudi Arabia served as a private Point 4 program. So the Point 4 program, for those of you who don't know, was a US Cold War policy put in place by President Truman in 1949, which called for American technical assistance to developing countries. The program dedicated millions of dollars to countries in the global South, sending scientific advisors, industrial and agricultural reformers, education and public health specialists, and economists to help the global South become modern. Of course, modernity in this case was largely defined by the United States' own strategic interests. And the primary goal behind the Point 4 program was to make sure developing countries align themselves with the United States in its ideological battle against Soviet communism. So Stegner was correct in noting that the kinds of technological and industrial programs Aramco had initiated in Saudi Arabia would predate official Point 4 programs in the global South. His omission of American missionary work in Saudi Arabia, however, leads to a more important misreading of Aramco's history, including the fact that Aramco had co-opted existing missionary rhetoric about progress, development, and technology. Just as importantly, Aramco had also adopted the public health and technical education programs that missionaries had already put in place in the 5 decades which preceded their arrival. The American missionaries who initiated these programs in the Arabian Gulf have often been left out of the history of American oil development. And the book I'm currently working on, again, fills this gap by tracing how missionaries more generally were among the first to introduce ideologies about development, modernity, and progress throughout the world, and how this played out specifically in the quote-unquote mission field of Saudi Arabia, with consequences that would last for decades. As I hope to demonstrate today, cooperation between these different groups of Americans eventually led to the creation of the first Middle East studies departments in American universities. The emergence of modernization theory in these very programs, I argue, was the logical intellectual culmination, not a point of beginning, but an obvious conclusion resulting from the ideas and approaches to the Middle East that had driven these Americans on the ground. So now let me turn to the first group of American Protestant, who are the American Protestant missionaries. As I mentioned earlier, American medical missionaries working on behalf of the Reformed Church of America, or RCA, arrived in the Arabian Gulf in 1889 under the name the Arabian Mission. Although driven primarily by religious faith, the foundational documents of the mission revealed how religious beliefs overlapped with more secular understandings of the world that sought to define progress and modernity on American terms. Before leaving for the Gulf, the founders wrote a hymn describing their future work, which encapsulated their vision of Arabia as a quote-unquote neglected land. One of the verses of this hymn explicitly melded beliefs about God's divine plan with common 19th century beliefs about the existence, once again, of stages of historical development. This verse revealed an understanding of Arabia that conformed with many ideas of the time, placing Arabian societies on a ladder of development, again, where the United States is occupying the top rung. Such beliefs explain why technology in the form of Western medicine would serve as a central tool in the Arabian mission's plan to convert Muslims. One missionary doctor referred to the use of medicine as, quote, gospel artillery. In their words, curing Muslims' physical bodies would serve as the, quote, opening wedge in curing their spiritual bodies, and eventually lead to the, quote, occupation of Arabia. After arriving in 1889, the two founding members of the Arabian mission, Zwemer and Cantine, opened a missionary station and a medical dispensary in Basra, so current-day Iraq. By 1891, they had opened 2 more stations in Bahrain and Oman. By 1914, with their numbers swelled to over 24, not including local workers, they had opened 3 hospitals. The Mason Memorial Hospital in Bahrain in 1902, the Lansing Memorial Hospital in Basra in 1911, and the American Mission Hospital in Kuwait in 1914. By the end of World War I, the Arabian mission had become the most important source of Western medicine in the Arabian Gulf, treating thousands of patients a year across their hospitals and during their tours throughout Arabia, which led them into current-day Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Oman, Yemen, and Iraq. Their public health facilities continued to expand in the following decades. They opened a 4th hospital in Oman in 1934 and a 5th in Qatar in 1947. In addition to their medical work, they also opened schools where they taught English and industrial skills alongside, of course, lessons from the Christian Bible. These missionaries reflected wider trends in the field that maintained that in order to advance their work, missionaries needed to learn local languages and study the religious faith of the people they were trying to convert. In the first decades of the 20th century, this type of missionary education became more organized, more institutionalized, and more global. In 1906, Samuel Zwemer organized the first, quote, missionary conference on behalf of the Mohammedan world, where 120 participants from 29 different Protestant missionary societies gathered in Cairo. 2 more conferences were held in the following decades, dedicated solely to the goal of converting Muslims to Christianity. So let me emphasize this point here. In the same decade that the British founded SOAS in 1919 to train future imperial officers, Americans founded schools of Oriental and Islamic studies to train future missionaries. Indeed, one of the outcomes of these conferences was the opening of specialized schools. In 1911, Hartford Seminary in Connecticut opened the Kennedy School of Missions, which soon included a dedicated department focusing on teaching missionaries to convert Muslims. And I'll return to this school a bit later, so keep it in mind. Similar programs opened in other theological seminaries throughout the United States, including Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Back in the Middle East, Zwemer left the Arabian mission to help found the Cairo Study Center in 1912. The center served as a school for Arabic and Islamic studies, and again, with the primary goal of training Protestant missionaries for work amongst Muslims. In 1921, the center was renamed the School of Oriental Studies and later merged with the American University of Cairo. During these years, the Arabian mission also expanded its reach, opening a new station in Kuwait in 1909, from which missionaries sought to travel into the territories controlled by Ibn Saud. In this endeavor, they were constantly rebuffed. not by Ibn Saud himself, but by British political agents in the Gulf, who worried about the extension of American political influence at the hands of these missionaries. Given that the opening of hospitals and public health programs mirrored British efforts to solidify its colonial control, the British often saw the public health work of the Arabian mission as being in direct competition with their own interests. Despite British efforts, the missionaries were finally able to meet Ibn Saud in May of 1914, when they were called to offer medical treatment for the ruler, his family, and some of his soldiers. Relaying the story to their missionary journal back home, one missionary doctor expressed his hopes for the future, noting that, quote, Bin Saud himself wants us. The occupation of Najd is sure to come sooner or later. In the next 3 decades, the missionaries increasingly offered medical treatments to Ibn Saud and his extended entourage, soon spending months at a time there each year. Again, the missionaries' influence was not lost on the British. From the missionaries' first meeting with Ibn Saud in 1914 and through the 1930s, British political agents followed the Americans' movements closely, and beginning in 1915, they actually began to intercept and read the missionaries' private mail to track their work and their interactions with Ibn Saud. They were increasingly convinced that the missionaries were spreading anti-British and pro-American propaganda. The following years appear to validate British fears about the missionaries' potential for advancing American strategic interests. Given the American missionaries' impressive network of contacts, by 1929, when the industrialist and philanthropist Charles Karine, probably many of you know from the King Crane Commission, sought to meet Ibn Saud in person, he actually relies on the missionaries' aid to facilitate the meeting. With their help, Crane would eventually meet Ibn Saud in 1931. During his meeting with Ibn Saud, Crane volunteered the services of his employee, the engineer Carl Twitchell. Twitchell then goes on to search for water and mineral resources in Arabia, and he eventually, of course, finds oil, setting the stage for even greater American involvement in Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, in 1929, Standard Oil had already signed a concession with Bahrain and opened the Bahrain Petroleum Company, or BAPCO. Shortly after its founding, BAPCO signed an agreement with the Arabian mission. BAPCO workers would receive medical treatment in the mission hospital, and in exchange, BAPCO provided funding for the mission. In 1934, BAPCO covered the salary of an additional nurse to work in the mission hospital and paid to construct an entirely new building for the Arabian mission to extend its public health offerings in Bahrain. In 1933, Ibn Saud signed the concession with Standard Oil, leading to what would eventually become Aramco. The missionaries' role in shaping Ibn Saud's decision to grant the oil concession to Americans was made explicit by the ruler himself. Speaking to an American missionary doctor in 1937, he stated, "The British want our oil, but wherever they go, they take over. Our experience with Americans has been nothing but good. They've helped us, they've come in here and served us, so I've given my concession to the Americans." On their side, the missionaries began to gear their educational program to train local Arabs for work in the oil company. In 1936, the Arabian mission commented on its close relationship with American oil companies in their journal, Neglected Arabia. Labor, both skilled and unskilled, was necessary, especially men who had knowledge of English, and the mission did what it could to supply the needs. This is from the article. The missionaries proudly noted that 60 of their former students were currently working for BAPCO. But Arabian mission doctors, including Dr. Louis Dame, also worked covertly with Standard Oil in attempting to influence local Arab rulers to sign new oil concessions with Americans. When Dame visited the Sheikh of Qatar in 1934 to provide him with medical treatments, he used the opportunity to push the Sheikh to sign a new concession with Standard Oil. The British, suspecting Dame's multiple allegiances, followed his movements closely and tried to prevent him from future travels throughout the Gulf. This cooperation continued in the following years. Knowing of Dame's close relationship with Ibn Saud, 2 years later, Standard Oil convinced Dame to leave the Arabian mission to go set up the medical department of what would become Aramco. Meanwhile, Babco opened its own medical center in 1944. The Arabian mission, however, continued to cooperate with Aramco's medical staff, offering medical treatments to Ibn Saud and his family, while also offering religious services to Aramco's employees. In exchange for treating Aramco's Arab and American employees, its American workers donated their money to fund the Arabian mission. After World War II, this cooperation extended to the adult children of missionaries from Beirut, including William Eddy and Harold Hoskins, who also happened to be cousins. Eddy served as the ambassador to Saudi Arabia while also serving covertly in the CIA. After Eddy officially left the US government in 1947, he accepted a position as a consultant for Aramco, working for them until 1956. Once again, during this time, he continued to serve as an undercover agent for the CIA. He was not alone. In 1951, the CIA acknowledged in its now declassified correspondence that had 5 agents working undercover for the CIA working at Aramco. After World War II, as American strategic interest in the region grew, knowledge about the Middle East was becoming increasingly important to Americans. Aramco had the same epiphany the missionaries had 4 decades earlier. In order to succeed in the region, American oil executives needed greater knowledge about the languages, history, religious beliefs, and cultures of Arabia. In 1945, Aramco hired the American Arabist George Rentz to open the company's Arabian Research Division. The division's chief function was to, quote, know and understand the Arab and his country. To know the Arab, one must also know and understand his religion. But once again, the connections between Aramco and the Arabian mission here ran deep. Rentz's father had attended Princeton Theological Seminary with Edwin Calverley, a missionary who worked for the Arabian mission for over 3 decades. The two were close friends, and Calverley would be in constant touch with the young George Rentz. Undoubtedly shaped by this relationship, when Rentz was 20 years old, he served for 3 years as a teacher for an American Protestant mission school in Syria. Calverley continued to serve as Rentz's intellectual mentor after Rentz returned to the United States in 1935, helping to guide him during his studies on the Middle East. By the time Rentz accepted his position at Aramco in 1945, Calverley had retired from the Arabian mission and was teaching at Hartford Seminary's Kennedy School of Missions, the school I mentioned earlier. While Rentz was working at Aramco and with Calverley's guidance, he completed his PhD, focusing his dissertation on Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. During his time heading Aramco's research division, Rentz sent several of his newly hired employees to receive training under Calverley at Hartford Seminary. Calverley instructed Aramco employees in Islamic studies, Middle Eastern history, and Arabic. These studies, of course, were entirely paid for by Aramco. So I just want to pause here and emphasize this. Aramco oil executives are being sent to an Islamic studies missionary department in an American theological seminary to learn about the Middle East from former American missionaries. So this cooperation went both ways. Between 1952 and 1957, Calverley also served as a paid consultant for Aramco, which included visits to Saudi Arabia to offer lectures on Islam and the history of Arabia to Aramco employees. Building on other missionary precedents, in the late 1940s and 1950s, Aramco dramatically expanded its public health and industrial education programs in Saudi Arabia. This included setting up industrial schools to train young Arabs to work for Aramco and enlarging its segregated medical facilities, and setting up malaria eradication programs in areas from which it drew its local Arab workers. Now, these programs were central to Aramco's propaganda efforts to sell its benevolent presence in Saudi Arabia. But I want to make this very clear. They also helped the company directly by training Saudi Arabs to occupy lower level labor positions and making sure they didn't miss work days due to health issues. And I can come back to the kind of calculations they made here later. Aramco's public relations department also began publishing pamphlets advertising this work in both English and Arabic. These pamphlets reinforced the narrative of technological progress and development that Aramco was trying to sell about their presence in Saudi Arabia and the alleged harmonious cooperation between Arabs and Americans in this pursuit. So let me provide just a few examples here. I don't know if you had a chance to read the fine print in the opening slide, but let me enlarge it for you. Quote, "There is nothing permanent about a footprint on the Arabian desert. A gust of wind and it's gone. A lasting imprint on the ancient desert wastes of Saudi Arabia is being made, however, by Americans and Arabs working together. Benefits born of the oil industry, education, health, agriculture, and public works programs, these will endure for generations." So these benefits included roads and electricity. Notice the plan words here of Aramco paving the way. Here we see a focus on Aramco's public health programs, and here education, which of course was highly focused on industrial education, which of course meant jobs for Saudi citizens as well. Ignoring the ongoing strikes by oil workers who protested that only Americans benefited from the management positions, while Arabs were forced to do the poorly paid menial labor and live in segregated labor camps, Aramco pamphlets made sure to emphasize how happy these Arab laborers were. Indeed, as this pamphlet notes, Saudi Arabs were clearly delighted by Aramco's presence and all the progress it had brought to Saudi Arabia. This type of Aramco propaganda also made its way into major American magazines, as you can see here from this 1947 issue of the Saturday Evening Post. So at this moment, let me shift to the third group of Americans, the US government. Beginning in World War II, the US government also came to realize the important strategic interests of Saudi Arabia. In addition to providing millions of dollars in Lend-Lease aid during World War II, and subsequently Point 4 funds, the US government began military and police training missions for Saudis. This, of course, was later accompanied by millions of dollars of military weapons sales. This new form of technological aid and training came in handy when the Saudi police and military were called out to break labor strikes by Aramco employees. In the post-war period, the US government also came to the same realization as the American missionaries and Aramco executives. Given expanding American interest in the Middle East, there was a dire need for more trained specialists. The State Department and the CIA began to call for the creation of Middle Eastern studies programs in American universities. Aramco strongly backed these efforts and donated large sums of money to open these new academic programs. To organize these new ventures, universities relied on existing experts in the field, which included Aramco executives, CIA and State Department officers, British Orientalists, and of course, former missionaries, including Edwin Calverley, who played a central role in shaping these programs. As a result of such calls, the Near Eastern Studies Department opened at Princeton in 1947. An announcement for the program in the Princeton Alumni Weekly noted that the major objective of the program was the, quote, training of men for government service or business positions in the Near East, or for teaching and missionary work there. The attendees of a 1947 conference, which included advisors and contributors to the new department, underscores my point regarding the ongoing cooperation between American universities, Aramco, the US government, and these new Middle Eastern studies programs. So I won't cover all of the people on the left. I was told that it was really excessive to go through everyone, so I'm going to spare you that. But I will go through just a handful. So there was Philip Hitti, who was the primary, many of you will know, who's the primary founder of the Near East Studies Department at Princeton. Hitti was born in Lebanon and attended American missionary schools as a child and later AUB before obtaining his PhD from Columbia. Alongside Calverley, Hitti had served as an academic mentor to George Rentz before he worked for Aramco. In fact, it was Hitti who suggested Rentz's name to Aramco when the company was looking to hire an Arabist. Hitti himself had previously worked for Aramco in 1945, teaching Arabic to their American employees and translating their concession agreements into Arabic. Harold Hoskins, whom I mentioned earlier in the paper, was William Eddy's cousin and also the son of missionaries in Beirut. During the war, he had also served as an intelligence officer in the Middle East and later served as President Roosevelt's personal Middle Eastern operative. After the war, Hoskins would serve as a consultant to Aramco and other oil companies. Walter Wright Jr. had just been hired as a professor in Princeton's Near East Studies Department. Wright had previously served as the president of Robert College, an American Protestant missionary school in Turkey, and during World War II, he had also served as an OSS officer in the Near East Division. Harry Snyder, who wasn't included in the group picture, was a former Protestant minister and a UB professor who would go on to serve as an intelligence officer and Islamic specialist during World War II. After the war, he helped negotiate for the American Air Base in Saudi Arabia. In 1952, Snyder would serve as the Director of Education and Arab Training for Aramco, setting up its industrial education program. And finally, Donald Wilbur, also not seen in the group picture, perhaps due to his previous and future role as a CIA agent. In 1947, Wilbur was a young graduate student at Princeton, where he became a specialist of ancient Persia. He too had served, as I said, as an intelligence officer in the OSS during the war. As some of you may know, 6 years later, in 1953, Wilbur became one of the primary architects of the CIA's covert program known as Operation Ajax, which overthrew Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran after he had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. So I hope this has convinced you of this close relationship that existed between missionaries, members of the State Department, the CIA, Aramco, and academia, and these new Middle East studies departments. So returning to the Middle East, the Arabian mission's cooperation with Aramco led to unintended consequences that would slowly make their own work obsolete in Arabia. In 1954, Dr. Paul Harrison, a missionary doctor who had worked for the Arabian mission for 45 years, noted his attendance at a conference of the Persian Gulf Medical Society, this was an organization that had been created 4 years earlier that gathered medical doctors working throughout the Arabian Gulf, the Persian Gulf. The conference was hosted by Aramco in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, which in itself was very telling. Harrison noted that medical missionaries were now vastly outnumbered by doctors hailing from oil companies and government hospitals. He also noted that oil companies and Arab rulers had opened hospitals in Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. All three areas, of course, were ones where the Arabian mission had already opened their own hospitals. Harrison nonetheless highlighted the positive role that the Arabian mission had played in bringing about these changes. Missionary efforts have not been failures, he wrote. They have set an example which the oil companies and governments are following. In the 1960s and 1970s, almost a century after they first arrived in the Arabian Gulf, the Arabian mission was forced to close most of its hospitals and missionary stations. The oil men responsible for bringing about this shift nonetheless recognized the important role the missionaries had played in setting the stage for their work. In the 1950s, William Eddy noted that his work for Aramco was a continuation of his parents' missionary legacy in the Middle East. As a consultant on Arab affairs for the Great Arabian American Oil Company, I have been involved, as were my father and grandfather, in programs of education, health, imparting skills for vocations, and extending goodwill for the USA, which is the legacy of our pioneer missionaries. These views were echoed by others who worked in the oil industry. In 1962, Charles Hamilton, a former American oil executive, published a study where he also made direct links between the work of American missionaries and oil development. As he wrote, many persons feel that American commercial interests might not have had the opportunity to participate in the development of the great oil fields of the Middle East, had it not been for the splendid work of the Arabian mission. Hamilton proudly noted that American oil executives had carried on the work begun by American missionaries, and together they had brought modernity to the lands of the Middle East. Americans, he wrote, have a right to be proud of their contributions to the social and economic awakening of the Middle East. Now, although we should question the benevolent narratives put forth by men such as Hamilton and Eddy, these sources nonetheless reveal the longer historical and ideological ties that linked American religious, commercial, and strategic interests in the area. In the end, unsurprisingly, the missionaries' goals of using technology to convert and occupy Arabia were never realized. And although Ibn Saud and the Saudi state incorporated technology into its own state-building exercise, it will not come as a shock to you to learn that Saudis never abandoned their religion to convert to Christianity. Americans, however, had offered important lessons to Saudi Arabia. By the final decades of the 20th century, the Saudi state had fully adopted the consumerism of free market capitalism and successfully used religion as a tool to exert the state's power. Aramco and its employees had also taught Saudis the complicated and brutal relationship between capital and labor. Americans may have succeeded in spreading a certain faith to the Saudi state, but it was a faith in capitalism, not Christianity, that eventually won out. Thank you, and I look forward to questions or comments.
How fantastic. So I'm not going to stop the recording because I don't mind my questions being included. So I do have a bunch of questions. I have like so many millions, in fact. But first of all, I want to have a book suggestion. There's an amazing Iranian novel called Sabvashun, written by Simin Daneshvar, and it takes place in Iran during the Second World War. It was written in the 1960s. And it has missionaries as some of its sort of central characters. It's and a missionary hospital, in fact. And it's really fascinating. It's actually the first time that I, when I was a little kid and I read the book, it sort of introduced the topic of missionaries in the region. I do have a couple of questions. The first is, when were religious restrictions instituted on Aramco? Because if Aramco operated alongside these missionaries in Saudi Arabia, obviously sometime in the 1950s or 60s, that changed, and in particular in Saudi Arabia. So I'm curious about when and how those religious restrictions were instituted. First question. The second question I've got is, how does religion and piety fit into this? Because there's obviously the missionaries had a faith in modernity and in sort of the capitalist way of life, an American way of life, I should say. And so I'm curious about whether piety was something in there, or was the sort of the mission really just to Americanize. And then finally, I wanted to say I found it really fascinating that Constantine Zareh was as one of the people in that picture, because of course Zareh is the person who came up with settler colonialism and then the word Nakba early on, and so it was funny to see his name along the list of the people that had been trained at Princeton. I've got so many other comments, but I'm going to stop there with the 2 questions that I've got.
Should I go ahead and try to answer?
Yes, please. And then
Okay.
after you answer, I'm going to turn off the recording.
So the question of religious restrictions is a really good one. From the beginning, the Arabian mission wants to set up a mission in Saudi Arabia, and Ibn Saud also always turns them down for optics, I think. So they're never allowed to have an actual mission in Saudi Arabia, but they spend 4, 5, 6 months there at a time. So he has a good relationship with them. And he sets up these restrictions where he doesn't want them to proselytize, but he also knows what they're about. So it's very, very complicated. And I try to tease that out in the book. My sense is that so Ibn Saud, for those of you who know his background, he was actually very, very sick as an adolescent. And the story goes that he was treated by a European doctor when he was 14 or 15. And I've had trouble kind of tracking this down. So he had this very deep respect for the idea of Western medicine. So he's constantly asking them to come. They will come in 1919 during the Spanish flu, where Ibn Saud loses his wife and his firstborn son. And so he has this kind of debt to them that is really fascinating, but at the same time, once again, he does not want them to proselytize. So it's a very kind of complicated relationship. So the question of religion and piety is a good one. And I'd say the complexity, once again, I couldn't express it in the paper. There are some missionaries that are very, very supportive of the oil companies, and then there are others, and Paul Harrison I would put in this category, who speak about the fact that once oil comes, it is destroying Muslims. It is destroying what he respects as their religious faith and their piety, because it's being eaten up by capitalism. So he is a very kind of critical of American capitalism in ways that you don't see necessarily by other missionaries. So they're very much divided on this issue. And then finally, yes, I mean, there are so many people that I don't mention in at that Princeton conference. I could go on and on for hours about that Princeton conference and their writings. They come up with a book, and how fascinating it is, including, you know, some Zionists that become very prominent later.
Wow,
So
that's amazing. Sitting alongside Zorae. I mean, that is really incredible. Okay, I'm going to turn off the recording now. And